after 9/11 as to whether the federal government should have this measure of power in the first place. What's important is that this meanwhile comes at a very intriguing time in Washington. The White House has been put in a somewhat awkward position of having to defend a program that in fact candidate Obama back in 2008 had a lot of criticism of. Since he's become president, it seems the White House has decided that some of these tools are of value to the administration when it comes to national security. That being said, many Democrats remain very wary about a lot of this government power, not just in NSA surveillance tools, but the Patriot Act, wiretapping, interrogations. What has changed are Republicans. A lot of Republicans have felt on the back foot politically in recent years over questions of national security and foreign policy. It took a beating during the Bush years. A lot of them don't necessarily agree with the president's actions, drawing down troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, but they have been very wary of speaking out because public opinion is very much for the president on these things. And in that vacuum of silence, meanwhile, you have had an entirely new, younger generation of House and Senate Republicans elected who came in the post-Bush years and who have a much more libertarian bent. And you've probably heard from some of these guys, or Rand Paul of Kentucky, Justin Amash of Michigan. And the result, and I think this is why this is very different from what is happening in the IRS, is that there's this new coalition forming. Think of it as a sort of libertarian coalition that potentially has the power to affect some very substantial national security changes going forward. We saw an attempt at this in July when Mr. Amash in the House actually put forward an amendment to the defense spending bill that would have in fact effectively ended this NSA metadata program. That bill, that vote, again with the liberal libertarian coalition behind it, lost by only 12 votes. The potential for that coalition to come together again to grow and to tackle other issues like military interrogations or drone use or other surveillance tools is very big, and I expect that we will see some very high-profile votes on this in the fall. The point again is that unlike the IRS, these NSA revelations are already having a profound effect on the national debate and moreover the political ordering in Washington and potentially big effects to national security. Once we get done with recess, both of these issues are likely to explode again, as I said, and they're going to come just in time, meanwhile, for yet some more government-generated crises. If any of you were people in the room who actually enjoyed last year's Christmas and New Year's where we all waited on the edge of our seats to see if we were going to fall into default or everyone was going to be hit with a great big tax hike, guess what? You're just going to love this fall because we're going to do it all again in an even bigger scale. This is going to be one of the more painful legislative records, or sessions on record. The first of these moments is going to come on September 30th when the government officially runs out of money. I have lost track of how many years it has been since the House and the Senate have fulfilled their most basic obligation of passing spending bills. It certainly has not happened, I think, in my time down here. I think at the moment there are 13 of these that they're supposed to pass. I think the House has passed 4. The Senate passes 0. And so what is likely to happen is that come September 30th, Congress wants to get together, pass a continuing resolution. And this is another way of saying that they pass legislation that basically continues to fund the government at existing levels. Now, up to a few weeks ago, the thinking was that Republicans and Democrats would come together to pass a short-term CR and push this off for a couple of months. Republicans, who never miss an opportunity to make a situation far more complicated than it could otherwise be, now have a certain faction of their party who are demanding that any CR also include a provision that defunds the president's health care bill. Even assuming that John Boehner's House actually passes such a bill, there is almost 0 chance that it will be brought up in the Senate. And even if by some miracle it was brought up in the Senate and it got a vote and it actually passed, it would of course be vetoed by the president. At which point Republicans would need 22 Senate Democrats to abandon their president and his signature initiative to vote with them to override the veto. I can tell you that I have a better chance of becoming president than this happening. What is far more likely to happen if they continue on this course is that if Republicans pass a bill that does defund the president's health care legislation, they will pass it, the Senate will refuse to bring it up, neither may budge, and on October 1st, the government will run out of money and we will have a shutdown for the first time since the 1990s. And this is a very big possibility that this could happen. If, by contrast, the Republicans choose not to take this course, we could indeed see an agreement for a short-term CR. All that does, however, I would note, is create an even bigger crisis moment in that it will push off a debate about the longer-term funding of government so that it coincides precisely at the moment that the country is again hitting the debt limit. This is likely to all take place in November. And it will also come just as the government faces the prospect of yet a new round of sequester cuts that are supposed to kick in January. I think what's a little worrisome here is that we are once again in the classic standoff situation in Washington. The Democratic strategy on these types of showdowns up to now, and I have to say it's been fairly effective, has been to say, you know, I'm not going to negotiate with the Republicans over the sovereignty of our debt or keeping the government funded. It's up to them to do this. Democrats come out and say this, and then they don't blink. And that is what the president is saying now. He's calling on Republicans to unilaterally raise the debt limit and also to mitigate the effects of the sequester, and he's waiting. Now, the Republicans did in fact unilaterally raise the debt limit back in the spring, and they didn't ask for anything in return. But one reason they did that was in fact precisely so that they could push all of this off into the fall and have it correspond with the debate over government funding, so they could kind of use a combination of all of this to try to get something of their own priorities out of the president. Because the reality is that they do have some leverage here. The president would in fact like to get one great big whopping debt ceiling increase, one that would last most of the rest of his second term, because you know he's pretty tired of dealing with all of this. Every 6 months there's a great big crisis and we have to have another one of these debates. It interferes with the things he's trying to pass. It gets in the way. The other reality is that Democrats are indeed very concerned about this newest round of sequester cuts that are coming in January, and in particular their potential to hurt some of their more cherished domestic spending programs. So the Republican strategy here is to make this a very big moment, to sit back, let Democrats sweat a little bit, and then say, okay, we may be willing to maybe cancel some of the sequester, maybe put some more money into your programs, and maybe up the debt ceiling, but only if in return you give us something big that we want. What is it that they want? That's the trillion-dollar question. They have not actually enunciated that yet. It could be, again, some ask for a major entitlement reform going forward. It could be that they ask for something that has to do with policy, maybe some sort of change in the president's health care bill. I personally cannot see how any of this is any different from the fights that we have had in the past, where we have not managed to get any big solution out of this. And so I don't really have much hope that this is going to end well. What I can tell you is that as soon as September or potentially later this fall, this country will once again be facing a white-knuckle moment where everyone in Washington teeters on the edge of both a shutdown and potentially another debt limit breach. One thing I would note, and it's just, probably most of you know this, it is worth bearing in mind that when people say that we could default on our debt, we can't really default on our debt for a number of reasons. That's a big misunderstanding, and politicians who tell you that is true, it's not exactly honest. But were we to not be able to, if we went past the debt limit, if the government could not write checks, what could happen? It could severely rattle the markets. It could throw the country back into a recession. It could, and certainly lead to the government being unable to pay plenty of its other obligations, like Social Security, like Medicare. So this is, in fact, a very big deal. And to add to this, again, just for the fun of it, we're going to have the IRS revelations coming out. We're going to have the NSA debate. We're going to have another huge and rousing round of the immigration discussion when the House picks it up. We're going to have a continued fight over the Farm Bill. And we will also have, just to make things really, really interesting this fall, the official debut in October of the president's healthcare exchanges and all of the things that go with that, the changes in premium costs, the changes in plans. Depending on your political persuasion, this is either going to be not very much of a big deal, or it's going to be one of the biggest healthcare debacles of all time. All I can say is that I'm glad it's still August. I was telling my husband the other day, if I'd had any idea this was coming, I would have saved up all of my vacation time for the last 5 years and used it to take the rest of the year off. But to go back again to how I started this, here we are, year one of the president's second term. And what we're finding is that it's looking very much exactly like the past 2 years. Washington has pretty much since 2010 been lurching from one crisis to another, using the brief lulls in between those cliffhanger moments to try to do something small of substance. I think there were a lot of people that were hoping that the launch of this second term was going to somehow change that dynamic. But what we are finding so far is, in fact, there doesn't seem to be anything sort of orderly or planned or agenda-driven about this second term so far. This rather appears to be the new norm in Washington, these series of crises. And what changes the dynamic, I have to tell you, I'm not quite sure. It could be that it is some other, again, dramatic election, but I'm not going to talk about that because I said I'm not going to talk about elections tonight. I actually think I'm going to stop there. This has been a bit of a hodgepodge of an overview, but as I just mentioned, in some ways that's actually an accurate reflection of what is also happening in Washington. I thank you very much for the time that you've given me tonight, and I'm very happy to answer any questions, election related or otherwise, if you have any. Thanks. Okay, yes.
Monday, we were all awakened to the shocking news that the Washington Post had been sold. What do you think the successor to the Washington Post will look like under Jeff Bezos?
You know, I would hope, I was thrilled to hear this news. I mean, as someone who works for a newspaper who had a well-moneyed individual take over the Wall Street Journal a while ago, you know, newspapers are suffering from capital and they're suffering from innovation, and they need both of those things to survive in a new world. I remember only about 8 or 9 years ago, the Wall Street Journal still devoted something like 10 pages of its back pages to publishing the stock tables. I mean, does everyone remember these days? It seems so ancient. You know, you pick up your phone and you get your stock price by the second these days. That gives you a measure, an indication of how the news world has changed. And what's nice to see about what Bezos is doing is he seems interested in putting money into this venture, and he has the platforms, digital platforms, to potentially do something new and different with the Post. And to the extent that anyone wants to invest in old media, I'm a big fan of that. I don't know what it might mean in terms of the Post's political inclinations or anything like that, but it should mean that they have a more solid financial footing. And that also, by the way, means more competition. There are just too few newspapers around these days of good value, and the more we have, the better journalism should be.
Thank you.
Yes.
A few weeks ago, the Obama administration announced that they were going to delay the employer mandate on Obamacare, which requires all employers with 50 or more employees to provide health insurance or else pay a tax of $2,000 per employee. They put that off until 2015 instead of 2014. How is the president able to do that without getting congressional approval? Isn't this a statute that Congress passed?
It is indeed a statute that Congress passed, and you have indeed put your finger on the big question in Washington, is how can you just unilaterally change the law? Now, the White House claims that they have the authority to, they can't be ready in time, then they can't be ready in time, and that's just the way it is. I mean, it seemed to go a bit farther than that in that it officially is delayed for a year. But there are growing questions. I mean, this does seem to be something this administration does more frequently than others, which is it sort of says, we don't like this part of the law, we're going to do it this way. And that has become a bit of a political thing in Washington. Now, in fairness, plenty of presidents have in the past sort of taken a certain amount of license in, you know, interpreting the laws that they look at. But this does seem to be on the outer edges of just saying, we're not going to do what the law very specifically says that we have to do. I think the bigger question is how you actually administer any other part of the law if you're not doing this aspect of it, in that the employer mandate was basic to the functioning of the president's healthcare law, and that the employers are supposed to be ground zero of collecting information about who actually has health insurance and who does not. which of course is a big important question of who has to, complying with the individual mandate and whether or not you pay a penalty, whether or not you qualify for subsidies based on the other health care that you get. If the business world is not reporting any of this information, we're going to have a system that is entirely based on trust. And that's an awfully big program to be running on trust. Yes, sir.
Back in the early 70s, we went through a period called a transition quarter, and it changed the fiscal year from June 30th to September 30th. This was to ensure that Congress could pass their bill. What do we have to do to hold them accountable for that?
Well, I think this gets to, there has been this new question in Washington recently. What do we do about a Congress or a White House that won't follow the law? Congress is obliged under the law to pass these spending bills, and it just doesn't do it. There has been talk about balanced budget agreements or some sort of bigger framework that would include some sort of penalties for Congress if it can't get its act together and do it. Docking people's pay, for instance. The sort of stuff that would happen to average Americans in the rest of the world if they didn't get their job done at the time they were supposed to get their job done. But this is sliding. Look, the White House is officially under the law obliged to submit a budget by a certain time each year. I think it's in February. I think they were 2 months late this year submitting a budget, and they were a month late last year. Deadlines, laws, this all seems to be not a big concern to anybody in Washington these days.
One more question.
Yes.